So before we get started, I just wanted to share a few thoughts and also wanted to show my gratitude to all of you and to our communities who are facing so many challenges together through these very uncertain times. I just wanted to share a few thoughts and a bit of framing before we hear from our panelists. So my name is Sebastian Chapler. I am a head teacher by training and a community organizer by vocation. And it is 44 days ago that Boris Johnson made this very important announcement that the country would go into lockdown. And since this announcement, it became very evident that the way we lived was about to change dramatically. This announcement was made a few days after schools were told to remain partially open. As soon as lockdown was announced in France, where I'm originally from and where my family still lives, I started worrying about my brothers, whose livelihood depend on being on the front line. I started worrying about how they would manage to pay for their weekly food shopping, their bills and other necessities. I started worrying about my partner's parents who rely on us to do their shopping at the weekend, but also keep them company at the weekend. I started worrying about my own partner, who is 6 months pregnant, as she officially became an at-risk member of the public. Since lockdown has begun, I've spoken to colleagues in many schools and we've sometimes cried together at the thought of children being stuck in overcrowded flats with no garden, no access to a computer, and very little food to eat. I've cried with families from the school where I was the head teacher for 6 years, as they share their anxiety about their children not really understanding what was going on. I've mourned with colleagues as an incredible friend of ours, a former colleague, passed away about 2 weeks ago, taken away in her mid-40s, leaving so many hopes and dreams behind. We've mourned without being able to hug, without being able to cry on each other's shoulder, without knowing when we'd be able together to celebrate her life. My anger has grown as migrants, often living in some of the most deprived areas of the UK, have never been under so much pressure. The fact that Hackney, Brent and Newham, all located in one of the richest cities in the world, London, are places where you're more likely to die because of COVID-19 than anywhere else in the UK. These are statistics that are too real for us to ignore. But I've also seen neighbours reaching out to others to make sure that everyone had enough to eat. I've seen teachers shift from being curriculum designers to being food bank managers. I've seen head teachers reach out to families in ways we'd never seen before, just to ask parents and children, are you okay? Do you need anything? We miss you and we love you. We've seen health workers and teachers put themselves at risk to take care of others. So I've watched as people recognize that those who stack up our shelves in supermarkets deserve a living wage. I've watched as our nation started to recognize that schools are much more than a collection of textbooks and classrooms. I've watched as key workers got the recognition that they've always silently deserved. I've watched a nation that recognized how all these key workers are vital to our lives. I've watched as emergency legislation was passed in response to the pressure of civil society to support rough sleepers across the country. I've watched as we started to realize how interdependent our world is in a very personal way, that the health and well-being of anyone is intimately bound to the health and well-being of all of us. The interdependence of our society has never been so clear. And I'm not the only one who's seen these things. I'm not the only one who's played a part in addressing the many needs of our society. We're in a moment right now where the entire world is facing a crisis. We're seeing the cracks which many of us have unfortunately decided to ignore for too long, sometimes decided to hide those cracks. We're seeing the inequalities across our communities in ways which is now impossible to ignore. And it is organizers, it is school leaders, teachers, community workers who are stepping up to reweave the fabric of our broken society. We have an opportunity in this moment to take care of each other, to look after our communities and to work together to better prepare ourselves and especially our children for a world which becomes more compassionate and equal. We have an opportunity to see ourselves as part of a global society which is at the forefront of a struggle for a better world. We have the opportunity to work together to forge a new world, to say and to see what is possible out of the crisis which we're now going through. That we can decide to take action on the things which matter to us and which we know are right and just, to protect our loved ones now and for years to come. So today we're starting a conversation about what schools should do, what schools are doing, to not only respond to the crisis, but also to shape a society where our communities can thrive. So today we're very lucky to have a range of leaders who will not sit still when the world in front of us is crumbling. By demonstrating that change is possible, these leaders are helping us to shape a world as it should be. They're helping us to hope, but importantly, they're helping us to realize that it is not hope that leads to action. Rather, it is action that inspires hope. So we'll hear from school leaders to start with, preceded by a very short introduction from Leora Cruddas from the Confederation of School Trusts. And after presentations from Leora, Fiona, and May, and Chris, we'll take a few questions. So if you could please put your questions in the chat or in the Q&A section, that would be great. In the second part of this evening's webinar, we'll hear from community leaders, Josephine, Jackie, and Graham, and Imogen will introduce those speakers and we'll say a few words about community organizing. And in the same way as we would have done with the first panelist, we'll welcome a few questions afterwards. So without any further ado, I'd like to now hand over to Leora, who's going to talk to us about civic schools and civic trusts. Over to you, Leora.
So thank you for those extraordinarily powerful words that you started off with. I completely agree that what COVID-19 is teaching us is the interdependence of people in society. I'm particularly interested in how civic institutions play their role in creating and sustaining that interdependence. And I wanted to talk this evening about the systems of meaning within which schools and trusts find themselves in. In particular, I wanted to talk about schools and trusts as relational institutions and the importance of the word trust, schools and trusts as resilient institutions, so the importance of strength, and finally, schools and trusts as civic institutions, and coming then to the importance of place. Now, I'm not going to do all of that justice in the 5 minutes I have, so I'm going to give a flavour of some of my thinking on this. In relation to schools and trusts as relational institutions, I think trusts the word trust has a variety of different meanings. The first and foremost, I think trust is a relational principle. And our education system must, I think, reclaim trust as a relational principle, both during COVID-19 and beyond it. But by this I mean that all schools and trusts must have as a core focus the behaviours and actions that everyone in the organisation, particularly every adult in the organisation, will take to build trust. Secondly, trust as a core value. I think trust is an essential human value that quantifies and defines that interdependence that you talked about, Seb, in our relationships with each other. And I think as a value, trust should help us and can help us determine the rightfulness and wrongfulness of our actions. Thirdly, trust as character. And this relates to Stephen Covey's work, in which he talks about character and competence. So character includes school leaders and trust leaders who act with integrity and whose intentions bring about the results that we want to see in terms of wider educational and social good. I think this speaks to the ethics of leadership and of public service. So fourthly, trust as competence. The public will not trust us unless they believe we are competent to lead and govern. And as we think about opening schools more widely, this is particularly, I think, important. And finally, trust is a promise. So Kofi Annan, who is the late, great Secretary General of the United Nations, said, "There is no trust more sacred than the one the world holds with children." That is also the value statement of my organisation, putting trust at the heart of everything we do and our sacred duty, really, to educate children. So I said I would mention, secondly, the importance of resilient institutions. And I think that we've seen schools and trusts show extraordinary strength and resilience during the COVID-19 crisis. And it would be good to think about how we build resilient organisations as we go forward, as we come out of the initial crisis of COVID-19. Perhaps somewhat controversially, I do think that the strongest and most resilient of school structures is the multi-academy trust. So the power of a group of schools being able to act together. Not because I believe that academization is the panacea, not at all, but because I believe in the power of a group of schools and of people acting together. So finally, schools and trusts as civic institutions, and I said I would come back to the importance of place. I think it's really important that schools and trusts understand their role in place, and this comes to, I think, the main theme of our conversation tonight about schools and trusts at the heart of their communities. We can only adopt our civic role as leaders if we understand that our institutions that we lead, the schools and the trusts that we lead, are indeed a new form of civic structure, and that we take our place alongside other civic actors, alongside local government, alongside the NHS, alongside trade unions even, and that we act together consciously and deliberately to create the value of the child in society and to build better education and social outcomes in the communities we serve. And I think that's my 5 minutes up.
Just a bit of background about Surrey Square Primary School. We're a 2-form entry school for children aged 2 to 11 with around 480 pupils. We are on the edge of the Aylesbury estate in southeast London, in Souvic, serving a very diverse community, as you can imagine. Our pupils entering the nursery are significantly below age-related expectations. Only 34% of last year's intake met those expectations, but they leave us for secondary school significantly above national expectations. 98% of our families sit within the lowest 40% on the Income Deprivation Affecting Children Index, the EDACI score. In terms of looking at our response to the current COVID-19 and lockdown crisis, it's helpful to look at what we at Surrey Square have responded in the past to pastoral need in our school generally. We have a mission statement at Surrey Square that informs everything that we do. And this is personal and academic excellence, everyone, every day, where we explicitly name our focus on all of us as whole people. And this includes what's happening for our families and children at home, rather than just focusing on their learning. And during lockdown, I think what we've done is simply continued applying this mantra. It's our #1 priority. So pastoral support is overseen in the school by our pastoral support team, which has been effective for nearly 15 years. And that team consists of our 2 co-heads, 3 assistant heads, me, the place to be manager, attendance officer, playground lead, various visitors come and visit to sit in on our meetings. So it's a truly multidisciplinary team. The team as individuals has a collective 80+ years of service at Surrey Square. We meet weekly without fail. And this system provides, it ensures that no child or family slips through the net. It's very much about whole families. We don't just discuss children, it's about what's going on at home. So in the pastoral support team meetings, we discuss safeguarding concerns, information sharing, and then look over past minutes. And the whole staff team really does feed into the process. The system is well known, it's shared, it represents one of the core mechanisms in the school that we couldn't function without. So having had that system up and running for so long, this was our starting point when it became clear that school was to close. And during those last 10 days before the school closure, we worked tirelessly to get systems in place to ensure that our pastoral support for families would extend over the lockdown. That was the top of our agenda, thinking about our vulnerable families. So we drew up a vulnerability matrix, starting with children with education healthcare plans, those with child protection or child in need plans, families where mental health is an issue, either parental mental health or with the child, and those families who are regularly discussed during our pastoral support team meetings. A key part of our provision for vulnerable children includes those parents who have insecure immigration status, and particularly those who are subject to no recourse to public funds restrictions, of whom we have a lot in the school. We're acutely aware that time doesn't stand still for these families with insecure immigration status. They're continuing to apply for leave to remain or renewing their papers or for their child's citizenship. And we are able to support them even in lockdown through that. We've been doing a year-long project in collaboration with Citizens UK and Coram Migrant Children's Centre. So we're able to continue signposting parents to a specialist lawyer who can advise and support on all issues related to immigration. And I've dealt with 3 of those this week. So at the moment, we have 131 families currently on our vulnerability matrix, which is over 230 children, as well as 7 former families, all of whom have particular vulnerabilities and that we're still in touch with. There's a core team of 3 of us managing this matrix, and that's 2 of the assistant heads and myself. And we're in touch weekly or fortnightly with these families. And there are 4 other members of staff who also have a few families each. We have regular documented contact with the families, and that means that we can monitor how they're doing on a day-to-day basis. We're conscious of the new vulnerable, and we've added extra families when needed. People have been in touch with us. A former pupil was in touch and needed some support. She's been put on the list. What we see is that the effectiveness of our pastoral work during this crisis is largely due to the trust that's been built between the school and families. And Leora mentioned trust, it's so key. The relationships that we've nurtured over many years, a sense of belonging and connection. We've also carried out wellbeing surveys with parents and children as well as staff, and are analysing those results carefully and taking action when needed. So food poverty was something we knew would be a very real problem in the case of lockdown. Our children get free meals a day, 2 free meals a day. We have a breakfast club, and we already have mechanisms in place to deal with that during holidays to combat holiday hunger. So we set up a supermarket voucher scheme for those eligible for free school meals, but we're acutely aware that those with no recourse to public funds wouldn't be eligible for that funding. So during the week before closure, one of my heads set up a GoFundMe page specifically to raise funds so that we could send supermarket vouchers to families with no recourse to public funds. And we've got about £4,000 in that fund, and it's being well used. So we're also able to get food parcels delivered to families, and we've got 113 on that list at the moment. And that's through pre-existing links that we have with a local community organisation called Pembroke House. Much of the support for families that we've been able to provide during lockdown has been because of the effectiveness of our networking and long-standing partners with local collaborations. These community links have been invaluable, and we have open and frequent channels of communication with them, and it's given us the opportunity to develop some really effective means of supporting families. For example, we're going to hear later from Josephine, who runs PACT. I'm on the steering committee for PACT, and in the first week of lockdown, I was able to go and visit the baby bank that PACT run to get a buggy and some nappies for somebody who was about to have a baby. So just to summarise, I think our community links that pre-existed the lockdown are even stronger now. The effective collaboration with multiple partner organisations through a crisis like this has really nurtured that. And the next phase will be recovery, and we're already thinking about that. There's an analogy that's really helpful when thinking about supporting our communities and building resilience. And that's what's better, a fence at the top of a cliff or an ambulance at the bottom? And the work of our pastoral support team over many years is aimed towards building that fence, putting practices into place that are preventative and responsive rather than reactionary. And this is what we'll continue doing throughout and beyond the lockdown. Thank you.
Hey everyone, thank you, Seb. Yes, so I'm a Teach First ambassador. I did my training in a secondary school in 2006 and spent about 6 years doing that, and then moved into the primary phase and spent a couple of years as a primary head teacher as well. And that whole experience of working across education really, and in really fantastic communities, just led me to believe that whilst a good school is necessary, it's not sufficient if we want to ensure that children have the best life chances. And that's why I then went to work for Reach Children's Hub just over a year ago now. And Reach Children's Hub is a charity that supports children and families in Feltham. So it's really community facing, but it was started by the founders of the school. And in order to understand why we exist, you really have to understand why, the school's founding principles, because they believed right from day one that a school had to be a relational institution in order to ensure that children would have could lead lives of choice and opportunity. And I think that's borne out in lots of ways. The first member of staff that they employed wasn't a teacher, it was a family support worker, and she still works with us in the hub team today. So that those relationships that she's built over the years and that the whole staff have are just absolutely crucial. So the school has always looked at ways to bring the community in, but in turn has also gone out into the community, and that's sort of manifests itself in home visits. Those happen really regularly by all members of staff for children throughout all year groups. And those relationships, again, that have been built up over the years have meant that we've been able to respond as an organisation and as a school in this time in a way that has meant our families and those children feel held in all the ways that they need to. So that's everything from doing food deliveries, obviously having food collections as well, all the wellbeing check-ins, but also really high engagement with online learning, and the learning being a really key part of this. So over 90% of children and young people engaging daily and submitting in the work, and that those sort of relationships and the expectation and the culture that the school has built up is absolutely key to that. So then the Reach Children's Hub really felt like a natural extension, and we only started in sort of 2018, but it was a way to develop and give more capacity and time to developing a community-led model and a cradle to career pipeline. So we start building those relationships now with parents during the antenatal phase. The school, I should say, is an all-through school, so it has 900 pupils aged 2 to 18, and then the hub wraps around that, because we're starting to do the antenatal work. We have a really rich early years offer supporting parents through that phase, and then move into youth engagement and supporting our young people in their post-school outcomes, and also bringing it kind of full circle with adult education offers. I think one of the things that, so two things really, one on the cradle to career aspect of it, that is such a huge scope, and there's so many things that we could do within that. And the bit to emphasize here is just the listening to the community, because it's so great to look out and learn from other examples of best practice, but we all know that our communities are ultimately unique, and if we were trying to replicate different programs or different interventions without listening to the community and without involving them in co-production and co-design and ultimately community leadership, which would the way we're going to build sustainability as well in these communities, then it feels like they will ultimately be less successful than they could be. So that has been something that's been really critical for us, engaging in listening campaigns. We're also working with Citizens UK, we're quite early on that journey, but it's been it's given us a really rigorous way to engage, and I think that's going to be hugely important, as Fee said, when we move into the recovery phase, because we need to understand again what the concerns and the needs are of our community and how those are emerging and changing at this time. And then just the sort of second thing in terms of how the school and the hub have been working in this particular time in a more integrated way than ever before. The school really being able to focus, like I said, on the wellbeing and the learning, but the hub has built relationships with other civic institutions over the course of a year, and that meant that for about a week before we went into lockdown, we were able to convene about 35 different institutions, charities, faith organisations, other schools, local counsellors, family nurse partnership, health visiting teams, and so on, and bring those people together to form sort of 3 different working groups to ensure that our community would have ongoing access to food, to mental health and wellbeing support, and to financial information and advice. That wasn't about us giving that advice, it was about signposting and making sure that they had access to those resources. And I suppose just to return to that theme of listening, those groups were decided and driven by doing a survey of the civic institutions and what they felt would be the needs of their community at that time and what we anticipated to be. But then really critically, 4 weeks in, we did a survey of 390 of the parents in our community. And so we were able to then test, was our response the right one? Did we need to change it? And one of the things, several things emerged from that, one being that families needed support, but they didn't know where to go. So we've been able to set up a helpline, a single number helpline that they can then call, and again we can carry on that engagement. So I've completely lost time, I'm afraid, Seb. So I'm gonna probably stop there.
Everyone, and what a great little get together this is tonight with everyone and things. So perfect time as my little 3-year-old walks through. So hopefully it won't end up like the BBC. Things so. Listen, but first of all, what a fantastic lineup of leaders, you know, from all sort of CEO level to executive head levels that are on here today, and it's absolutely brilliant because I'll be totally honest, if it wasn't for all these guys that are speaking and they're going to be speaking and all the guys that are listening, we would be in an unbelievably worse place than we are now. Okay. The DFE, just in my opinion, because I work in a really, really vulnerable school with 78% free school meals, the DFE have really let these people down. And by all us working together, sharing ideas, I personally couldn't have got through this with all the brilliant help and advice that I've had from you people and other people as well on chats and things. So basically where we were at Parklands, when Ireland shut down on the Tuesday before we shut down on the following Friday, I knew then that we had to take action. So I created what we call a Plan B, which was about looking after the child protection children, looking after the normal children that go about everyday school life. And I put together this plan, which the NEU then sort of took on and adapted, which was great. And I had called it a Plan B just in case the government didn't produce the Plan A. Now, when we go back to that Thursday night at 2 minutes to midnight, when they released the key workers list, which practically had every single person in the world on it except musicians and sports stars, then again that Friday meant we were working, doing a new plan that we'd already planned for before and things. So it was about basically looking after those child protection children, looking after the vulnerable children. And like Fiona said at the start, my big priority was food hunger. I'm one of the few schools that opened up my school in 6 weeks during the summer holiday to make sure that there's food inside bellies and that my child protection children are seen over that time. So it was basically my main priority was all about food. Now, I was a bit harsh on the DFE at the start and things there, but one thing they did sort of do, which was quite well, was produce that sort of online learning. But again, for middle class schools, that was brilliant. For schools like my own and lots of people on here, you know, I've only got 1 in 5 of my children have only got one device. You know, a lot of my kids with 4 and 5 in a household are trying to do online learning on the mum's phone. You know, then we look at the fact that in areas such as ours, the internet speed is so slow that, you know, and parents are parents, they're not teachers. So if you've got 4 children, 2, 6, 9 and 15, it's pretty hard to do homeschooling, as I said, when you've only got 1 or 2 devices. So we went down the homework line of doing lots of paper copies. We got all the old textbooks out that nobody'd used for years. We just sent those home. There you go. There's just something to do. So we wanted to produce learning opportunities. So for the kids who did want to go online, brilliant. But then we started getting the horror stories of people who were being threatened with detention in some schools if they weren't doing their online learning. They were being threatened that the grades were going to get low, and it's like, but if you look at the real problem, it might be internet coverage, it might be devices and things. So as I said, we went down the paper copy. Hey Pobble do the most amazing, brilliant, totally free, fun activities to be doing outside in the garden and in the house and things. So I'd either recommend people check that out. But going back to my big priority, which was food hunger, as soon as Ireland shut down, I thought, and I think the previous Saturday we'd had the toilet rolls all over Twitter and all over the news with people fighting in supermarkets over toilet rolls. So I thought, if I'm going to source food for these kids, I can't use the supermarkets because there's going to be a run on them. So I'll go straight to the wholesalers. So I got in touch with my kitchen contract team. So already 9 days before we'd shut down, I'd already started stockpiling and getting food coming into school. And I never went down the voucher system. I knew before it was even announced it was going to be an absolute disaster. Again, such a middle class system for really vulnerable, disadvantaged kids. Having a piece of paper, you know, to go and swap for food when the nearest supermarket's half an hour walk away, can't get delivery slots, and if you can get a delivery slot, if you're on free school meals, you can't really afford the £10 delivery charge. putting Waitrose on them. I can't ever really work that out, but that's no problem with Waitrose, at least a step two. So we basically worked with Leeds City Council, got together a kitchen hub where all in the east of Leeds, all the vulnerable children would get grab bags every day. And this has now evolved that the children now are getting 2 food hampers a week sent home. And we've worked out that cost is about £40–50. I always like at my school, for those of you who follow my lovely Parkland school, Fun Day Friday at the Fun Palace. Well, we've got a new hashtag now on a Friday, and it's Fun Day Freezer Day at the Fun Palace, because I've tapped in with great charity organisations like the Real Junk Food Project. And for the last 2 weeks on the Friday, I've distributed not just to my school, but to schools in Bradford, all around the crisis team in Leeds, 2,000 bags of oven chips, 1,000 burgers from Burger King, 200 tins a pop from Ben Shaw's, 2,000 bags of popcorn. So basically everybody in Seacroft at the moment on a Friday is eating burger, chips and having popcorn and pop, in addition to the food hampers that they're getting through the week and things. A company called Magic Breakfast have been absolutely lifesavers. This afternoon, they delivered me 300 tins of baked beans, 2,000 boxes of cereals, 1,000 boxes of Scottish porridge oats, 2,000 bagels. So again, they've got the food hamper that goes out on Monday and Tuesday. And then Wednesday, Thursday, I've got breakfast items before Fun Day Freezer Friday starts and things. So, but one thing that this has really brought us together, and this is what I meant at the start about all the head teachers, CEOs, executive heads of local authorities that have come in together. It's really brought on a community spirit. People are wanting and wanting to help in so many ways to be able to basically put food into children's tummies and things. And it's been the head teachers and everyone who I've just said that's been leading this from the front, because the guidance we've been getting is just been amazing. Now, I put a tweet out just before we came out on air tonight saying that I've just been told that the big announcement on Sunday about the schools reopening, which in my opinion, we shouldn't be really doing that yet, not until we get that death toll really down and things. They brought it forward to tomorrow at 5 o'clock, but I've just had a text message now saying they've reverted back to Sunday again, so the unions can still iron out these concerns they've got. So that's really good and things. So, but for community partnership and for those guys really working together, you know, and I'm talking private independent schools, I'm talking the academy chains, local authority schools like my own, instead of everyone arguing and bickering, everyone's really come together on this, you know, and everybody's had their own different challenges. As I said, I've teamed up with a couple of private schools where they've emptied their fridges and they've emptied their stock cupboards to be able to help us be able to feed our kids. But of course, they've still got their own concerns, because irrespective of what you think of the private sector, they depend on school fees. And this term, there's going to be a few people that have been furlonged, that have had successful businesses that have crumbled now. That are they going to still pay their fees? Are we going to be worried about the sort of private sector? But I said, in this particular instance, everybody, no matter what sector, has really come together, and it's been absolutely beautiful and lovely.
And good evening, everyone. My name's James. As Seb said, I work for Teach First, leading our work in really trying to make sure that all of the schools that we partner with have really great networks of external support that they can draw on. So fascinated by this discussion from both a personal and a professional point of view. Listening to this, one thing really struck me as a theme running through is the importance of trust, and noticeably that all of you school leaders that we've heard from reference the fact you've been building up this trust over years and years. That's what's allowed you to respond as effectively as you have to this COVID crisis. We also know not all schools have that same level of trust with the communities that they serve and that they work in. So my question to you is, whose responsibility is it to make sure that schools do build that trust? Is it yours as school leaders? Is it the government's, or is it someone else's? And what I'd love to do, if it's all right, is to go in the order that we heard from our speakers. But Leora, if you don't mind coming in last to kind of summarize as from more of the overall level. So yeah, Fiona, do you want to kick off on that one first?
Yeah, I'll try. In terms of who should lead trust, I think we can't rely on the government to force people to do that. I mean, I think it comes from the school. I think it's our responsibility to build trust. I don't know how schools can function without a high level of trust between themselves and parents. And that really needs to be built on, and it needs to be gained. I had a parent once say to me that she had watched me in the playground for 6 months before deciding to tell me her story. And I think it's about visibility, it's about approachability. All of our school leaders are in the playground on a daily basis, chatting to parents. You have those little conversations about your own family, just to break down barriers. We're all parents, and that's what we're saying to parents when we're phoning them now through this crisis, is how we're coping ourselves if we are parents, and how challenging it is, and that just because we're teachers, it's not easy for us as well, having children at home and coping with this. So it's about being vulnerable ourselves and admitting that we struggle as well. So in terms of building trust, I don't know whose responsibility it is per se, but I think we should absolutely lead it as school staff.
Thanks, Fiona. May, do you agree with that? Do you feel as a school you have the responsibility, but also the ability and the resources to build the trust as you need to?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think it's a big stretch to say that everyone who works in this profession or in this sector wants to have strong, trusting relationships with their pupils and with their pupils' parents and families, and that whole ecosystem of relationships and adults and who support those children. I think that there are, we want to work in a relational way. We don't want to work in a transactional way. So I suppose that's the only bit that I would say in terms of the systems that we work within at a policy level, and that perhaps are, especially when you're being pushed for sort of short-term outcomes or short-term sort of timeframes, that's where the pressure can come from, I think. But I definitely think that everyone wants to be able to work in that way, and it's how we, if as leaders, give space and enable people to do that. So, and then just I think 2 very small examples of how, as Fee said, like those making every interaction count, first of all, and the different things that you can do culturally within your school. So at Reach, all the teachers are on first name terms with all the parents, and that is because everyone is equal in that relationship around being a team around the child. So that's just a very small thing, but I think it speaks volumes in terms of saying how we trust each other and we want to work in this particular way together.
Great, thank you. I love that example. And actually knowing a teacher's name rather than just calling them Miss or Sir is a lovely start. Chris, what's your take on this? Do you feel this responsibility, and do you have the resources to enact what you would like to be able to do?
Totally agree with what Fiona and Mel said. Trust is everything. We have not been led by the government in this sort of crisis. We've been told, but then the onus has been on us. We'll be the ones that get all the criticism. We'll be the ones that get all the blame. I'm very much behind sort of the union's guidelines on this. I've got some great friends who are in the NAHT. I'm in the NEU, the old NUT, because they've always been very good to me. And they are the ones that are really going to drill down. And this is why that decision's been changed from Thursday now to Sunday again, to give the unions times to really make sure that they're looking after people, the unions, as opposed to numbers, We're in challenging times now, because are we going to be opening on the 1st of June? I very much think we are. And the inside track I've got is that it's going to be year 6. But I know that the unions are desperately trying to fight reception coming back. How can we social distance reception? Absolutely impossible. So I'm definitely going to be guided by the unions, because together we're sort of stronger. And as I said, I think I summed it up with the unions look at the people, which is us, as opposed to numbers and statistics, which the DfE are obsessed with.
Great, thank you very much. I'm really fascinated, honestly. No one's biting on the resources side of this question. So Leora, I wonder if you have thoughts on this. I'm inspired that you all want to take this responsibility and feel the need to take the responsibility for building trust. Could you do more with more resources?
I think, see, just before Leora comes in, it's a really interesting one, James, because I think what I heard, and again, just brilliant to hear from from all the speakers so far, is it seems to be the sustainability piece and the resourcing is because of the number of different organizations that come together, and therefore the load is shared between so many. That seems to be kind of one of the other themes that's coming in that everybody's mentioned so far, the kind of the collaboration and the effective collaboration for doing so. And I wonder whether the trust is built between the parents and carers in the school, but also in terms of those are no other sort of community actors, whoever they are. But sorry, I just wanted to jump in into it, but it was another theme that was coming through in those first ones. So Leora, over to you.
Thank you, Ruben. And those are absolutely brilliant thoughts, and I think I'm going to build on that a little bit. So what I want to say first is I think trust is very important to be a relational principle and an organizational culture if you're working in an institution, and schools are institutions, and therefore the creation of that culture is a leadership task. It's a leadership challenge to create a culture within which teachers and staff more widely are empowered to create trusting relational trusting relations. But I do think it's the behavior and the actions of every single adult in an organization that build trust. I don't think it's about a single person. So just as an anecdote, a couple of years ago, I was coming back from holiday and got sort of courtesy transport bus back from the hotel I was in to the airport, and two women got on the bus, and so we were flying back into the same airport. They started opposite ends of the bus, and they started to talk very, very loudly about the schools within which each of them worked. So they weren't working in the same school, they didn't know each other, they were working in different schools. And I won't say how they self-identified, but they weren't teachers. And both of them identified their schools by name and then talked very loudly across the bus about why the school that they worked in couldn't be trusted. And it just brought home to me with such power that unless you can galvanize every single adult in an institution, that their actions and behaviors are really, really important in terms of building trust. If you only focus on your teachers, or you think it's just a leadership issue, then you forget sometimes people who are the pillars of their communities and whose word will be trusted in their communities, even if they're not very senior in the organizations in which they work. So it really is everybody. Do I think the DfE can do it? No. Do I think the government can do it? No. This is an issue for us. James, to respond to your challenge about resources, do I think we need more resources? I'm afraid no, I don't. I really don't, partly for the point that Ruben makes, because I think this is in part about the power of collaboration, the power of organizations. I mean, ultimately we could all do more with more resources. But I was born and brought up in South Africa in the apartheid years, so it's painful personal history for me. But one of the things I saw most powerfully was in the poorest communities, in the communities who had very, very little in terms of economic resources, was the strongest sense of collaboration and trust and the ability to organize and take action. To come back to Seb's points, these people were not saying, if only we had more resources, we could do more. They were definitely not saying that. And I don't think it behoves us in education to make that argument in relation to our ability to build trust, no matter what resources we have. I recognise that's probably controversial, and I'm sure some people are going to have a view on that.
I think it's great. I'm going to try and ask school leaders who've just presented, literally in 10 seconds each, please. Great question from Joseph in the Q&A there. What would therefore be the first thing you would do if you were starting a school from scratch? What would you do to build that trust, or to start building that trust? 10 seconds each, please, and then back over to Seb. Oh, Chris, you're on mute, I think.
There you go, we happy? So what I would do in 10 seconds, I'd get rid of baseline assessment for reception, year 1 phonics test, year 2 SATs test, year 4 multiplication test, year 6 SATs test. I get rid of 5 exams in 7 years to really get a trust thing going where we're nurturing, we're loving these children, as opposed to test to satisfy the DFE data heads.
May?
I'd listen, I'd go out and have as many conversations as possible with as many different people across the community before thinking about anything else. I try and hold on to the idea of people before programmes, do the spade work, as citizens say, go and have the conversations, put the legwork in, and you will learn more about what that community, the assets that community already has and what they need. They know what they need, and then you can support them to do it.
Thank you. And Fiona?
Yeah, I agree with both Chris and May. I think having core values in a school is really important. So we have those, and we expect all members of staff to abide by those as much as we expect children and parents to. So I think it's about walking the talk.
Thank you all. Over to you, Seb.
My name's Imogen, and I started out my career as a youth worker, and then, like Seb, I was a community organiser for 6 years with Citizens UK, and more recently I've trained as a psychologist in educational research. And you're going to hear from Josephine about PACT, but part of my journey when I was at Citizens UK was thinking about how you could use community organising as an approach to work alongside schools, and I also work with Fee at Surrey Square to look at how you can build these partnerships of trust that we're all talking about. So I thought I'd just give you a quick flavour. So I thought I would just start with the how of how we do it as community organisers, what we're trying to achieve, and then just to give you, like I said, a few flavours of some campaigns I've been involved with. So in terms of how we go about doing it, so it's about identifying the core organisations in the community that are kind of ready to take action. So that's mosques, churches, charities, and schools, of course. And then we build these alliances where we bring people together across these organisations to identify what their kind of shared areas are that they want to take action on. And the way that we do that, we've heard lots of this language already, which has been great today, but we really put a lot of emphasis on one-to-one meetings and really taking the time to build trust by, and we also spoke, Fiona did a great job of explaining this earlier, about modelling our stories, because when we model, when we share, then people also want to respond. And just to follow on from that, so hearing you speak, Leonora, really spoke to me, because my parents are South African, and they left because they were anti-apartheid activists, and I was brought up to kind of, when you see things that are wrong, you stand up and you do something about it. So that was why kind of a career as a community organizer really spoke to me. And then building on those one-to-one relationships, we bring together all these different community leaders and individuals to identify those shared areas of action. And I think the advantage of doing that around schools is that it can be preventative. So it's about identifying how can we put things in place in our community before things become an issue that prevent families from thriving. It's about being ready in a crisis. And I mean, we've never been tested like we have been before, right? But making sure that the imam is already in a relationship with the head teacher, with the priest, with the charity leaders, ready to take action when we need to. But then it's also about tackling the issues that are coming up all the time in a kind of continuous iterative process of listening and taking action. So I thought I'd just give you a few examples which I think really stood out for me from my career. I have to just let you know I do have a cat that keeps trying to jump on my keyboard, and a 1-year-old that any minute could also come into the equation, so keeping it real here. But I just so after the 2010 riots, I was a trainee community organizer in Clapham Junction, where many of you will know was kind of one of the hot spots of the riots. And one of the things that came out, we did a massive listening campaign with 1,000 young people and community leaders in that area, and some really tangible things came out of that. So things like the local schools working collaboratively with young Somali men, many of whom were leaving school and really struggling to get jobs. They were sending application after application and not getting anything back. And we brought them together with some of the more affluent churches in another part of the borough in London, in Clapham, and they developed a great partnership which was all about getting young people school ready. And if we go back to People Before programme, the whole time we were thinking about how we develop the leadership capacity of those young Somali men to design their own kind of interwork programme, but with the support of other community leaders. So there is one, and we're going to hear from Pat, but the other sorts of things that we've been working on are things like the City Safe campaign, which is all about getting local shops. So how can we as well be building trust, building bridges between community organisations and shops to become safe havens for young people. Unfortunately, where I work in London, knife crime is a real issue. With FEE, I've sat around at a table with FEE many a time with local community leaders advocating to the local authority to improve services for families with no recourse to public funds. So just to go back to that question, is it all on the school? Absolutely not. I think the school can be at the heart, but it is also, and I think there is huge appetite for community leaders from a diverse array of civic organisations to support schools in their broader mission. And we're gonna hear from Pact in a minute, but Pact has really been certainly my life's work in terms of thinking about how community organising can bring together schools and civic organisations to support families right at the beginning of their lives. So we are now going to hear from an amazing lineup. So we're going to hear from Seb, forgive me, I'm not quite sure of the order, but I'm just going to say all three, and you might have to correct me. So we're going to hear from Jackie Redpath from the Greater Shankill Children and Young People Zone, Graham Duncan from Right to Succeed, and Josephine Namasusi Riley from Pact in Southwark.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Seb. I am so excited because I feel like sometimes I feel like a preacher, but I feel like today I'm going to be speaking to the converted because all the previous speakers have really spoken to me. Before coming to Pact, I worked for a charity called School Home Support, and our job was to support families, to support parents with issues that got in the way of their children's learning. And from that job, which I did for 7 years, I realized that we needed to start a lot earlier. So I came to Pact, and I think the reason that it's important is because it's an example of the earliest form of intervention that focuses on supporting parents, because we know that they have a key role in whether families thrive or not. We recognize and value parents of all backgrounds and abilities in their role to nurture and to be their children's first educators. The children benefit, of course, from having less stressed parents, from parents having improved skills and parenting knowledge, and parents who belong to a wider, strong community, parents who have access to information, who have additional support based on their needs and challenges, parents who feel more confident in their roles as parents, parents who model for their children from a very young age, and parents who are able to engage with services. I have to apologize at this point because I think most of the people that have spoken before me have got a teaching qualification or something similar. So I'm going to share my screen so that I can be a little bit more disciplined. Okay. I'm going to start with these two images, and they really spoke to me recently when I had to do a presentation about belonging, because I think that schools and institutions, even such as churches, might look a little bit like the right-hand side of the screen, whereas what we are doing at Pact is something like what you see on the left-hand side. And I will tell you what we do. I mean, the project started from a listening campaign that Imogen carried out with parents of young children, pregnant moms, and expectant parents. And at the end of that listening, the two most important challenges that parents had was isolation and mental health. And by mental health, it was depression and anxiety. So PACT started from listening to parents and bringing them together along with community leaders and civic institution leaders, such as school leaders, to talk about what could be done. And parents at that meeting decided that they wanted to meet weekly. So this is what has developed since then. So Imogen asked one of my colleagues now a question about serving an area of London that's very deprived, and said, what are you going to do about it? And this was Janet at the Salvation Army in Camberwell Green. And that was the beginning of the baby bank. So the baby bank received donations of baby items, baggies, nappies, clothes, shoes, and then they give them out to families who are struggling. And then parents, pregnant moms and parents of young babies, along with midwives and health visitors, sat together and co-designed the Parent University course. It has evolved since it was first started. In its current form, it is sessions for parents who are in their third trimester, and then sessions for parents afterwards who have children, babies under 6 months. We have, from that first Mom Space group, we now have Babies at Mom Space, which we had to listen to parents who had done Parent University, but had also attended Mom Space. And they said they needed a safer space where they built their confidence before they came into the hustle and bustle of the bigger groups. So last year we launched Babies at Mom Space, and that's a group for parents who have children under 12 months. We've got Espacio Mama, which is for Latin American or Spanish speaking parents. We've got Dad Space. We have got a family food club and an allotment project, which started from listening to parents around their challenges and concerns around childhood obesity. We have courses that in direct response to the needs of parents. So, you know, there'll be parenting courses, for example, around childhood obesity. Parents say, we would like to learn from each other. We would like to be able to share our recipes with expertise to help us improve those recipes. So the Family Food Club was born. At the center of what we do is our volunteers. And I can tell you now that the majority of our volunteers are also parents or have been parents that have belonged to the project. We work in partnership with health visitors, with midwives, with faith groups, with schools and other civic institutions. We develop parents into leaders by building trust and facilitating courses and giving them opportunities. And we celebrate when we do something well, and even where we don't do it very well. The work was evaluated, and this study, the results of which came out in April 2019, showed that of 40% of mums who came to PACT were at the threshold of getting some kind of intervention for mental health. And at the end of 6 months, 67 had recovered. We have a high percentage of hidden population groups in Southwark. And so we have a very diverse community. As a result of that study and the results of it, we were funded by Nesta to replicate some of what we do in other parts of the country. So we then replicated Mum Space and now Dad Space in Newcastle and Leeds. And the other area that didn't actually succeed, but we learned a lot from why it didn't, was Lewisham, which was, you would have thought it would have been easier because it's another London borough, but it didn't work very well. And I don't have time to tell you why it didn't. So our family, as I said, is very diverse. We welcome everybody. If you're pregnant or you have a baby in arms or you have a buggy, you're welcome to come to PACT. We have a lot of migrant families. We have lots of families with no recourse to public funds or access to free NHS care. We have a lot of families whose first language is not English, parents who are digitally excluded, and this has come to the fore since the lockdown around language skills, digital skills, and just internet access. A lot of parents are cleaners or low-paid workers who are on 0-hour contracts, etc. But we also have a number of parents, quite a few parents who are well-to-do, but may have some vulnerabilities that make them feel uncomfortable going to other services. So they just come and they blend in because we don't ask people what they do. We are all parents and we just support each other. And lastly, I'll just talk to you a little bit about how we build the capacity of parents. As I said before, our focus is on parents because parents then, when they're happy and well supported and more confident, can ensure that their families are also happy. Listening is the main strategy. We listen and we listen and we listen again, because we are a community. We allow parents to contribute their ideas, whether it is to read a story during story time, or whether it's to lead a song, or whether it's to come and speak to the steering group. They come up with the solutions and they know what they need. So then we enable them. We create partnerships with other professionals that will come and input into what we can't do as parents for ourselves. And by that, we develop leaders. They're involved at all levels, from the steering group, from listening. I mean, the Childhood Obesity Project started from listening. Last year, we got some money from the Mayor's office because we did some listening around, being more inclusive, and all the work that we did that year was led by parents. The courses, parenting courses, community organizing, training parents to facilitate at the Family Food Club. And this enables parents to be well engaged with campaigns and to bring about change within our local community. And that is literally what we want to build. Within that, there are still structures of schools and churches and mosques and other institutions, but there's also parents of different backgrounds, of different abilities, and we all just come together to support each other and work together. Thank you very much.
I will attempt to stick to time, and thanks very much. Josephine, thank you for your contribution. Those two pictures of the two gardens will stay in my mind for a long time. They say pictures tell 1,000 words, and indeed they did. I did a TEDx talk in Belfast this time last year and was given 7 minutes to sum up all my life's work. What we're doing at the moment, and it was a bit of a struggle. So I'll try and do this in 5, but let me just say that in terms of the present emergency in Belfast here, the response to it has been very much community-led and community organisation-led. I'm a slightly older community organiser than Imogen is, sitting with that 1-year-old there, but yeah, from a different generation. But Belfast is blessed for a variety of reasons with very strong community infrastructure, and the response has been very community-led. And in Shankill, where I work, we, set up, I'll do this quickly, set up the hotline, helpline, did a database, updated it, delivered food and essentials, and increasingly dealing with mental health issues, which runs from the need for befriending right through to clinical intervention. And also now looking at education and children and young people in general, but education in particular, and discovering that the lack of any sort of IT in many homes, or them fighting, as Chris said, over one phone in the house, makes online learning quite difficult, and we're trying to compensate for that now. But let me say this, we've had a lot of crises in Belfast over the years, as you could imagine. The important thing is not so much what happens during the crisis, because human instinct in general lets us step up to that mark. The important thing is what's next, what happens next and what comes next. We will get through the crisis. As a society, it's what happens next. And that's at a national level, and at a very local level, and indeed in my experience at a personal level. You can get through the crisis. It's how you deal with the aftermath, the big thing. And the question there is how we mitigate against the worst. And in terms of children that we're talking about, I do believe that those that are already disadvantaged in the education system will be even further disadvantaged because of this situation. We need to work out how to mitigate against that, but also to sustain the amazing things that have happened during this crisis and not lose those. So that's enough of the crisis. Let me just go on to say what we're doing. I live in a community called Shankill in Belfast, in which we have the worst levels of educational underachievement in Northern Ireland by some distance. And that has been the case from records began. It's a place with 27,000 people and 5,968 0 to 20-year-olds. It's an important figure, 5,968. It's a place from which I come, and I was the last of that generation, the last generation, in fact, who did not need a single qualification or examination to my name, not one, to make my way in life, because I was going to go in through a passport from a father or an uncle or whatever into the heavy industry that Belfast was based on in that generation, shipbuilding, linen, engineering. I was the last generation to ever do that, and I didn't need a single qualification. And therefore, the community I come from does not have any tradition of needing to value schooling or education in the formal sense, because until 2 generations ago, the pathway was clear without qualifications. And that has left us with a dreadful deficit. And the challenge we have is how do we transform one generation of children's lives? The 5,968 that I talked about. It's not that people haven't tried to do stuff about that. We have the detritus of over 25 initiatives over the last 20 years in the Shankill around educational initiatives attempting to do something about this. They've all been marked by being short-term. They've all been marked by not being integrated with a whole. And interestingly, they've almost all been marked from the Department of Education as being school-based, as though the issue, which is structural in place, and I would remind you, some of you may remember Basil Bernstein, who said schools can't compensate for society. All these have been school-based, as though schools can do this job on their own, and it hasn't worked. 4 years ago, we established from a community base the Shankill as a children and young people zone. We didn't call it an education zone, because if we had, people would have assumed it was a schools-based program. We called it a children and young people zone because it was about the whole life of the child. And in doing that, what we were doing was, if we have a concentrated problem in the Shankill, which we do, of the educational deficit and the health deficit, etc., then if we concentrate on the solution and bring everyone together around it, that was the first notion, that would be better than not doing that. It was a place-based approach predicated on getting the right people round the table. Of course, it is one thing to get all the right people round the table. It is a totally different thing to get all those right people to do the right thing, and an even harder thing to find out what the right thing is. But we established this zone, and with those right people, we did establish some principles that are transferable, I believe, to a place-based approach, whether it's led by schools, led by the community, led by a faith-based organisation or whatever. Those principles are that you need to begin at the beginning. The beginning of this is that it needs to be child-centred and carried through the whole way. The beginning of this is beginning in early years, which has been established as the critical point. The second thing is to recognise that there is no easy fix, that this is a long haul. South Africa has been mentioned. This is the equivalent of Nelson Mandela's long walk to freedom for this generation of 5,968 young people. It will not be fixed next week, next month, or next year. Maybe in some individual cases it will, but structurally it won't. It needs to be done on a partnership basis, and it needs to emerge. There are no laid down rules and ways of doing this. It needs to emerge and learn through experience. And obviously it needs to be outcomes based. And I'll come to the end here by saying this. We have a government now back in play in Northern Ireland. local government with a programme for government based on outcomes, an outcome-based approach, which is wonderful to have that. But it's up here, not down here. In all our work with children and young people from a community level, through all the years with Sure Start, which fortunately we still have in Northern Ireland, and with our own community-based integrated services for children and young people, we learned this lesson. And it was a moment of realization after we established the zone to bring everyone together. And it was this: we had never come across a parent with a young child, and particularly a mother with a newborn child, never come across one who did not want something better for that child. No matter how weighed down they were with the most awful problems, we never, ever, ever came across one who didn't want something better. That's called an outcome. It's not the government's, it's the parents' outcome. It's the change that they want, there's something better that they want. And therefore it dawned on us, that's the starting point. How do we find it out? People have said it again and again throughout this session. You listen, you have a conversation. And in doing that, we have launched into a series of conversations with parents with young children and with children and young people if they're open enough to talk to us, among the 5,968. And that conversation is about the story they want their life to be. And having found out that story, we then design with them the pathway to get there. Government call it co-design, the pathway to get to that. And then as they take the first steps on that pathway to the story they want their life to be, we put around them sustained support. No one will make it on their own. None of us did. Sometimes it's only light touch support, other times it needs to be intensive, but that support's ongoing. And we're working on that basis. We're in the foothills of this journey. It will be a 20 to 25 year journey of transformation. I'll not be there at the end of it, but I hope other people will. And at that point, I'll end this contribution. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Graham. I'm from a charity called Right to Succeed. I should admit that I was part of the initial Teach First cohort. Reuben Moore trained me how to teach, so everything I'm about to say you can blame him for. So it's been a long road since then, but I've spent my entire career focused on this space of how we get the best for children from low income communities. And I think over these years, if I'm really frank, the thing that has frustrated me most is if we look at our public sector and our community sector more broadly and how it operates as a system, there are too many cracks, there are too many blind spots, and the bar for referral to different services and pathways is set too high. And as a result, we lose far too many young people's futures along the way. And when something like this happens, like COVID-19, it gives us the chance to start to think again and to start to think about what our future looks like and what we've learned from the past and what we've learned from this crisis and how we start to move forwards. Just to give you a little bit on Right to Succeed, our role is to organise communities to deliver place-based change, and that typically looks like two different things. It's either thematic across a whole local authority, generally education focused, and working with schools to overcome the major issues facing young people in the education system, whether that be exclusion, whether that be literacy or NEETs, aspects like that. The other form that it takes is whole place, where you tend to focus on a small community about the size of a ward or two and look at whole cradle to career transformation. How does that system become entirely different in the way that it thinks about and works with children and young people's support? COVID-19 has shown our society at its best and its worst. At its best, we've seen people coming together collectively, working together in a way we've never seen before, breaking down silos, breaking through red tape, and really, really starting to overcome this immediate challenge that we kind of face with incredible urgency. It's also shown the worst of our society, and the worst of our society is the level of vulnerability that we have allowed to exist in the background that has been freshly exposed by this crisis, and by the message that's coming from this crisis is we are all far more connected than we ever thought we were. And when you hear of nurses in London who can't afford to live and have to use food banks, and then you watch them go and be the heroes in crises like this, when you watch families with 2 incomes who can't make ends meet, at food banks who are part of the supply chain that's keeping us going right now. I think we've got to think again about this issue of vulnerability, and particularly as a group, what we do for our children and young people. Just as a quick show of hands from panelists, and for those who are participants, if you can put this on the chat, if you look at our system right now, if you look at the public sector and sector and how it works for our young people, out of 10, what would you give our system for effectiveness? Panelists, on the count of 3, I want you to put your hands up. 1, 2, 3. Right, so highest 4 down to 2 by the looks of it. So, and I can see 3's just come through on the chat, and I'm sure there's a load more to come as well. I don't think we know if we have enough resource, because frankly, as you've all just clearly demonstrated, we are not using that resource well enough to meet young people's needs. When you set a threshold really high to access a service, you're effectively saying we don't do preventative work, we do cure. And that's a massive, massive issue within our society. We talked a lot about trust on this call. A massive aspect of this is there are so many assumptions and presuppositions made when we are talking about how we get a community to work together. There are so many people looking through so many different lenses at an individual child, through a health lens, a mental health lens, an education lens. We need to move beyond that. We need to move to a place where this is a far more collective system, worried about children as a whole, where it's not just about trust, it's also about how you start to engage that community and give it agency and ownership. Because frankly, every community we ever walk into to start to work with, the community will tell you at the very beginning they are done to, they have no decision-making power, no say, and everything is done to them. And actually, the most fundamental change that really starts to drive things forwards is actually how does that community become a very, very active voice in the way that the services are shaped and brought together to best serve that community. So bang on 5 minutes, Seb, I will pass back to you and let's do questions with everybody.
And I think we've probably got time for just one question, and there's one big theme coming through all of the chat and the Q&A, which is really, I think, how do we use this crisis to sort of change direction, either change direction or sustain the outpouring of goodwill that we've seen. So let me start with Graham, and then kind of go in reverse with the panelists, if that's all right. And if I can ask you each to do just no more than a minute each, I think that allows us some scope of finishing on time.
Yeah, so just to give a very current example, James, we're working with a local authority, public health, police, social care, all the kind of main services, and the philanthropic sector in that place. And what they're starting to move towards is actually collapsing all the silos and moving a team covering all those resources into what is a very small community, but a very small community that sucks up a lot of spend on service. The steering group for the whole thing will be made from a range of leaders and a range of community members and all the rest of it. And it's a vision of what can actually be done by actually just re-engineering resource that already exists. Because actually the most difficult thing is always saying we need more resource, but actually if you can re-engineer what you have, you can make a really, really effective change. But it means people moving away from silos, from the hero mentality of my input is going to solve that problem, and moving towards a more collective approach. But it's hard, but it's the work that has to be done, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Graham. Pull down the barriers. Jackie, what's your sense? How do we sustain this?
Okay, I think the most important thing, is to recognise that there's a massive question there, and maybe the easiest thing I can say and the most difficult is that we need to be aware. We need an awareness that the biggest challenge will happen after this, and we need to carry that awareness and sensitivity into the new situation. I could say more, but to say it very shortly, I think that's the biggest thing that we can take forward.
Fantastic, thank you. Josephine, what would be your one big thing to take this energy and goodwill forward?
I think it's recognizing that schools and education and all these institutions need to start early. I feel like we're seeing children on our Zoom groups and parents who don't have a pair of scissors. We're trying to do the simplest of activities, and they have no resources. So in order for schools to do a great job, they need to start building those partnerships. I don't know how that would happen, whether through children's centers, but those partnerships with communities and parents, civic institutions, churches need to start now. We just need to start organizing ourselves, doing better.
Thank you. And Imogen, I think the kind of visual, lovely analogy here is brilliant about the need to think long term.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we've done an important lesson here. He's learned how to use a card reader, so that's let's get it in early. This is my answer is going to be like the equivalent of like a politician's answer, but it's a community organizer's answer. In that I'm going to say I don't know, and I'm not sure it would be right if I had all the answers. I think for me the next step would be regrouping after this and asking people who the people in this call, but people in communities, what really worked during this process, what did we do well, and how do we take this forward? So involving everyone in that conversation, but also asking what didn't work well, because there's lots of amazing stuff happening, but I think it's also really highlighted the gaps too, right? So I think regrouping, reflecting, and coming together as in our communities to go, yeah, what do we sustain and how, and what was missing.
Brilliant, thank you. And